Yeah, welcome everybody. My name is Linda Monsees and I work for the Institute of International Relations, and I will be today your host for this panel on critical infrastructure. We invited great speakers on this very complex topics, who I will now introduce one after the other. They all prepared a short statement, which will then probably help us to get a bit of an overview of what actually is at stake when we talk about the protection of critical infrastructure and digital transformation. Afterwards, we will then try to have a really good debate about the different points of views that were presented. And so you're very welcome to give me all the questions you have, and then we'll have a really great discussion afterwards. I asked the speakers to be really brief in their discussion, so we have a lot of time for Q&A. So let me introduce the speakers as they appear in the program. So first we have Jokhadze, who is currently working at the Cybercrime Program Office of the Council of Europe in Bucharest, where he's in charge of regional projects covering the Eastern Partnership and, of course, addressing cybercrime and electronic evidence. He had worked previously in different positions, for instance, at the OECD, and consulted the government of Georgia on issues such as data protection and cybersecurity. He also holds a law degree from the Tbilisi State University and the Lund University in Sweden. Next, we have Igor Kotsiuba, who holds a PhD from the National Academy of Science in Ukraine and has worked for more than a decade in industry and academia with leading players in cybersecurity. So Dr. Kotsiuba is the counselor in government and industry and founder at the cybersecurity agency iSolutions. So I think he will be of great value for this discussion. And he's really interested in the question of how to build capacity and restore the rule of law in cyberspace. Next, we have Cristina Marquez, who works as a senior data scientist at the INA data department at Singular, and she's active as an advisor and participated in various prestigious hackathons. She also holds a PhD from the University of Madrid and MIT, which she wrote on 5G and big data. And her thesis has been awarded with the Ericsson Kreutz National Award in Innovation and Sustainable Connectivity. Next, we have Karel Reka, who is the director of the National Cyber and Information Security Agency here in Czechia. He has long-standing expertise in the area of military information operations and hybrid warfare, which I think is an ongoing issue, which we will also talk about during the conference. And he was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General in the Czech Army. And since November 2014, he served as the head of the Special Forces Director of the Ministry of Defense of the Czech Republic. And our last speaker is Andreas Kuhn. Andreas Kuhn is a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in America, where he leads the International Cybersecurity Corporation with the ORF, America's Cyberspace Cooperation Initiative. His works focus on the new risks and challenges in international security at the intersection of emerging technologies, cybersecurity, and technology governance. So very welcome to all of you. I would like to just ask you to talk really briefly about your expertise and your insights into the question of protecting critical infrastructure, and please keep the time limit so we have a good discussion later. So, Jorge, why don't you start us off?
Yes, thank you very much. My apologies because the light is not really great here, but there is a very sort of limited solutions that I can do at this point. So my apologies for that one, but nevertheless, it's a great pleasure and privilege to be invited to speak on the topic of protection of critical infrastructure, which is actually very much close to my heart. And many thanks for the moderator of the session to have introduced a little bit about me. So I'm a Georgian national, as you have already guessed and heard. But for the last 5 or actually 6 years, I'm already residing in Bucharest, in Romania, where I work for the Council of Europe's Cybercrime Program Office, which is actually a specialized office created by the Council of Europe to deal with various capacity building programs around the world when they come to cybercrime and electronic evidence. At the same time, this is not the only subject matter on which I'm going to speak today. So very quickly, let me share my screen and explain what we'll be discussing for approximately next 10 to 12 minutes. And I'll try to keep myself succinct as was requested. So yes, I think that you can see now my screen, at least Zoom assures me of that. And let's proceed with discussion on two important subject matters, which is first the designation of critical infrastructure and second criminal justice response. So when it comes to designation of critical infrastructures, this is again a topic on which I would like to speak not in the language of different standards or different, let's say, approaches here and there, which could have been easy to do, but more of, let's say, the personal experience that I would actually myself had when working for the government of Georgia, when we had to actually find solutions to really quickly designate and design what is the critical information infrastructure and how to deal with its protection from different angles, especially starting with information security all the way to criminal justice. In the second part of my presentation, I will speak about one of the solutions that could be there in protecting critical infrastructure, critical information infrastructure, about which I will be speaking more specifically, and designing it as one of the tools that is probably nowadays underused, probably to a lot of, to a big degree when it comes to protection as such. But of course, this is quite challenging subject matter in itself. So let me start very briefly with why do we need to define what is critical infrastructure, and actually to define the critical information infrastructure, because it seems to be the key concept of protecting security of cyberspace, especially in the conditions where the governments are really striving for resources and not everything could be accorded with the same level of protection or same level of resources to each and every subject matter and every sector of economy. So the concept of criticality and critical infrastructure in itself, if you dig down to it, comes down to really just narrowing down your resources on what matters and protecting that particular resource, because it is the one that keeps you going not just as a state, but also as a society and as an economy as well. And when it comes to critical information infrastructure, sometimes we fall into the trap of really just thinking that, okay, so when we think about this, it's simply a critical infrastructure which is dependent on the information technology, information and communications technology. But again, this is probably not that much true, because again, there are a lot of factors in there, and some of those I will discuss on more specific examples. But at the same time, not every measure that you would need to use to protect the critical information infrastructure, the actual IT infrastructure of such entities, is an IT measures in essence. So a lot of those protection measures are not those that would actually entail the use of information and communications technology, but more simpler things or more complex things at the same time. And I think that when it comes to identification and designation of critical information infrastructures, or at least that's been my experience for several years before joining the Council of Europe, is that it still remains very much a national matter. Of course, there is some guidance, some standards to guide you, especially from the EU, on the EU side. But at the same time, it still remains a national subject matter due again to the national sort of value of the critical infrastructure to society, economy, and the state. And here on the screen, you can see some of the examples that we come up with actually working on different criteria, specifically the casualties criterion, the public effects criterion, and economic criteria when it comes to designation of critical infrastructure in Georgia, which was actually a direct response to the cyber attacks in 2008, when actually the cyber war, the only sort of at the moment officially recognized example of cyber war was going in Georgia. And in essence, it was also very important that this designation was done fairly quickly in a flexible manner and also responding to the threats that are before the state at the time. And the many of those items that you would see on your screen are fairly, I would say, classic or mainstream when it comes to designation of infrastructure that could be sort of shoehorned into one or the other category of, let's say, the casualties criterion, for example, potential effect of system interference or system termination, that could be sort of, and then could be a deciding factor in designating something as a critical infrastructure. But the overall process was not as smooth as that. I mean, just running all the potential entities and potential, let's say, the private entities through the checkpoint of the checklist of these potential categories. It was actually more nuanced. For example, we have to come up with something like, for example, special category of system users, which was actually a very interesting case when we tried to apply the concept of critical information infrastructure to the Parliament of Georgia, which at the time was a semi-parliamentary republic, and we still had the lot of difficulties to designate it officially as an infrastructure, because if you run simply through, let's say, the dry evaluation of the criteria that we have put in the law and in the bylaws, then actually we came to the conclusion that it was not enough. But at the same time, to use common sense, you are dealing with parliament, you are dealing with parliamentarians who are representatives of the people in that way, and are deciding very important matters. So definitely it is a critical infrastructure. And this is why, for example, special category of system users was designed as a specific sort of exclusive and unique category through which the critical infrastructure, information infrastructure, would be designed if, for example, even if the work of the parliament was not that much based on information and communications technology. And of course, there were a lot of other underwater stones, I would say, when it comes to designation of critical infrastructure. So, of course, it was very clear from the very beginning that it's easier, of course, to designate the infrastructures that are state-owned or just state-controlled, but it's far more challenging for the private entities. Not simply because, I mean, they're more sort of prone to refuse regulation, or they do not want to take upon many responsibilities that come with being designated critical infrastructure, including also economic and financial liabilities, but also because basically for the private entities to be a part of critical infrastructure, it's also probably also negative publicity as well. And we have actually come across, again, the ideas that, of course, having an established list of criteria can be a good idea, but sometimes you have to, again, use common sense, especially when it comes to private sector and some of the actors and some of the sectors of economy even that you wouldn't think that belong to the protection scheme, but at the same time are quite important when you put all the elements together and decide on their criticality. We came to the conclusion also that when it comes to the basic, let's say, level of protections, information security rules and policies still remain the point of departure when it comes to the protection of critical information infrastructures, because although the rules could be seen as very basic, sometimes actually the majority of them are not really connected with cybersecurity and with information security of the information and communication systems. At the same time, they are quite important to ensure that the agencies and the authorities operate in a way that keeps them as available at all times and their services available at all times to the public. And of course, cooperation is key, and I will speak about this a bit on a few other slides, but also we thought that specialization is the way forward, especially when it comes to just designating critical infrastructures, that also not to lump everyone together, but to design them in a few different areas when it comes, let's say, security sector, the energy sector, and the others. It was, of course, a natural designation also if you look at sectors of economy, but not that obvious if you look at state and private entities together in that regard. Now, when it comes to protection of critical infrastructure, what you'll be probably hearing more today, and this is why we want to open also discussion on this particular subject matter in the beginning of the session, is probably protection that is accorded through the cyber information security domain. And when it comes to protection of critical infrastructures and critical information infrastructure through the criminal justice means, for example, by fighting cybercrime, that is an area that is not that much sort of utilized in practice and not that much spoken about in international fora like this, although we still maintain as Council of Europe working on matters of cybercrime for more than 30 years already, if you count all the process of development of the treaties and recommendations, that we still believe it's the way to go when it comes to ensuring full protection of critical infrastructures and especially information infrastructures. And again, this could be done through different baskets. For example, what you're looking at the screen is a basic structure of our global standard on cybercrime, which is the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which deals with substantive law, so basically different acts that should be criminalized and then punished, or investigated on the other hand, and then prosecuted in national jurisdictions, but also across the borders. There are some procedural tools that should be used for more specialized investigations, for example, preservation of data, specialized powers of search and seizure, monitoring, interception. Of course, all of this under applicable human rights and rule of law safeguards and guarantees. And also, very importantly, international cooperation tools that could be also used in the protection of critical infrastructure. For example, the faster ones, like exchange of spontaneous information, expected preservation, or even actually notifying the other states through officially designated 24/7 points of contact that are created already, that are already there and are actually dealing with cybercrime. So that could be also used for critical infrastructure protection as well. So really just choosing the path in which you would deal with the challenges that are there, the information security and cybersecurity challenges that are there for the critical information in infrastructure is really down to where does this infrastructure belong. So defining the entity sometimes defines the response. That, for example, when it's a public entity and public entity is being obligated to notify the national law enforcement authorities about any, let's say, infrastructure attacks or any crime, which is a general obligation, that makes life much easier for criminal justice sector to react to this in a protective way as well. And when it comes to the challenges also, you have to understand that although there are many incident reports and you would see a lot of data that tends to give you a lot of very dark picture of many incidents happening, especially against critical infrastructure, when you talk about the numbers that go to actual investigators, they're very, very, very low. It's just a fraction of all the different reports, of all the different incident, let's say, reports that would finally end in the hands of the cybercrime investigator and would lead to investigation, and in the end to justice being served upon the criminal groups or individuals who have perpetrated such acts. Sometimes the challenge is that the criminal justice is seen as too regulated or saddled with procedures and especially safeguards compared to more, let's say, informal exchange of incidents between the computer emergency response teams. I've been there myself, working for approximately 5 years with the National CERT of Georgia and also communicating with the law enforcement at the same time on cybercrime matters. Again, very much the preference was given to more informal exchange of data than the formal one. At the same time, you have to be aware that through informal exchange, you will not get evidence that could be then introduced in the court of law and could be the basis, for example, for the criminal judgment by a judge. So as a rule, although there are, of course, some exceptions, but generally you have to go through all these procedural matters to receive admissible evidence. And finally, the two other sort of the shorter notions that 1% problem is at the core of perception and efficiency of response, because even though there are lots of reports that cybercrime officers and cybercrime investigators still receive, the rate of success of investigations is again very low and is globally estimated of about 1% of cases that are investigating ending in the criminal indictments. For many of them, just being terminated the case of investigations because the perpetrators could not be found. And especially for the private sector entities, when it comes to those designated critical infrastructure, they would prefer to follow the more discreet way of dealing, for example, the national security agencies or dealing with the CSIRTs or the national CERTs, rather than just have reputational damage of more public criminal proceedings going forward. But again, as a Council of Europe, we really see no alternative to criminal justice, to being probably at the moment the only tool through which you can hold the perpetrators accountable. Unless there is something else being designated or invented in some centuries, we have to follow again the criminal justice route to really hold the criminals accountable, also in cases of critical information infrastructure. So those were the 2 points that I wanted to share with you briefly. Apologies that it took a bit more time than anticipated. And my apologies in advance because I have to leave 5 minutes to 5 because of some urgent commitment, so I will not be able to participate in exchange of views. But before that, I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. Many thanks again. And back to the moderator.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for this informative first introduction to the theme, and especially maybe where we still lack the knowledge or where there's still improvement to do further research and further political actions. Okay, let's now continue with our second speaker, Igor Kotsiba. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you everyone. Happy to see everyone here in this panel. I think that's a really important panel, and especially happy to see Christina, because together with Christina we're driving very nice and collaborative program, Next Generation Internet, where we basically focus on some emerging technologies. And just today I want to show you 2 quite boring slides with the emerging technologies, which I see the, let's say, important right now for critical infrastructure. So basically, regarding hybrid threats and future of cyberspace, we understand that we've got hybrid threats, and during pandemic and after pandemic situation, we'll still have them. So basically, the trends right now, and trends means not something we will meet in 5 years. Basically, it's happening right now, and we work with this right now. And I will show in next slide how. I mean, the growing dependency between policymakers and technology. So we see in practically day-to-day business in iSolutions, we work on Horizon innovation actions regarding cybersecurity of energy systems, and we work on very specific regulations apart from standards. And that's a trend, just because we've let's say seen all this situation with Huawei and emerging 5G technologies. So basically policymakers were very specific with Huawei, but they need to become more general, right, to regulate the emerging technology. Disruptive use of artificial intelligence. Again, it's happening right now. I mean, cyber attacks are becoming more comfortable for the actors, just because they can easily use AI. And also cybersecurity experts who try to defend the infrastructure, physical or cyber physical. They also try to embrace this innovation. I mean, to utilize AI or machine learning, deep learning, explainable AI to be secured. So the attacks now can be designed to have these cascading effects in critical information infrastructure, right? And critical infrastructure. And the attack can be broader in impact and damage, and bring huge damage to society and day-to-day life. Offensive cyber operations backed by these AI solutions, they are quite efficient, cheap in, let's say, not that many bitcoins must be spent for such attack. They can be precisely targeted just because of preparation phase, which can be done with AI, and difficult to attribute. Just because this is a question we discussed a lot, because in cost action, where management committee on AI for digital forensics, we try to develop new approach, just because we understand that AI or any algorithm which is deciding or basically brings decision support to the law enforcement to put somebody in the jail must be well designed, right? So we as humans just understand this. So I want to show you the solutions and basically projects we are participating with EU and European Commission. So I do believe that those emerging trends are, we understand that business, private sector, and public sector can be quite far away from those trends, right? For these, I do believe the best framework we can see is Horizon Europe. Just because Horizon Europe is focusing on emerging things, is focusing on innovation action, which means we need to think about, work on something new. And for this, we've got Electron project just started 2 months ago, where together we iSolutions, having our experience in Ukraine on the attacks we had here, we included in this project Prekarpattia Oblenergo, which is energy company who was attacked 5 years ago by automated cyber attack, and it caused the blackout of the whole region. So, and together with Atos, Thales, IBM, we work on a new platform to secure the energy infrastructure, taking into account all the emerging technologies. I mean, vehicles and renewables and decarbonization, energy transition of the cities. Second project is Response, where we try to create a secure data lake for smart cities such as Brussels, Zaragoza, Turku, Dijon in France. And we were trying to manage this pillar, digital pillar of European climate neutral and interconnected city, which we can see in a few years, right? Or maybe in 5 years. So, and we also take active part in cybersecurity policy and using AI, big data for digital forensics, cybercrime investigations. And I want to say that we utilize as much as possible a European Commission framework, just because in Ukraine, we have this 10 years or 11 years old experience with cyber crimes investigations, delivering solutions to our customers. And then we understand that for us, it's really good opportunity to deliver our expertise and work together with European cities, with European stakeholders, and be a stakeholder for designing next generation policies together with ENISA or European Parliament. So I want to say that, so even though when we sometimes it's bad to talk about AI just because people do not understand that it's reality, that okay, we can say that AI is providing decision support for electric vehicle, for many things, and we understand, yes, it provides decision support, but how can we secure it? And basically AI can be a bad thing itself, right? And for this, in iSolutions Labs, we also work on verification of AI algorithms for safety critical infrastructures. So I want to to summarize that, yes, there are emerging threats, emerging technologies, and there are instruments in Europe which are being used to face those issues, to address those new challenges. So that's just to summarize, and I do believe that Q&A can be the best choice here. And yeah, and just to add, what can we do next in Europe? That we need to share the course of action. I mean that when energy grid is attacked in Ukraine, within minutes, we need to share the information and better course of action with the energy company in Czech Republic. And that can bring us even more resilient infrastructure within Europe. And we need to just use like vaccination against COVID. We need to use somebody's attack to save us in other cities, in other nations and organizations. Thank you, and yeah, see you. Let's talk in Q&A session. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm sure that, once someone mentions artificial intelligence, there are usually lots of questions. I'm sure we will come back to this issue at the Q&A. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Then Christina Marquez, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share also some slides, so please let me know if you can see the other screen. I don't see any of you saying yes, so maybe there is an issue with that.
Yes, I think it works.
Okay, perfect. So I'm gonna be also really quick because I think the discussion is important. Just to let you know, I'm Cristina Marquez from Singular. Here is my data, just in case you want to contact me later. And well, Singular is a startup that is in several countries, and basically we operate around the globe. So it is important for us, this topic, as well as data protection. And we serve many industries. So the same, we are focused on many topics, and we want to protect our clients and their data. But moving on to the important topic here today, cybersecurity. Also, I want to mention Igor. It is wonderful to meet you again, and always to meet NGI explorers around the globe. But let's focus now on this. As I mentioned, we are interested in all the topics, and among the questions we could think about is what are the limitations of the preventive politics? Well, in my opinion, it's mostly time, but not only that. Also, it requires a lot of collaboration between different entities and actors until regulations are approved. This changes the framework really quickly when the technology evolves so fast. And the standardization is also a problem because there is no solution that suits all the problems. It depends on its organization, on its industry, and well, as an example, I put here in Spanish, sorry about that, an example of a critical infrastructure that could be attacked either in the sensors or in the database. And all this has different procedures to be protected and different standards. But again, it's difficult to cover all of them. So in order to define these profiles that are required to define every piece, NIST or NIST core framework for data privacy is a good first step to face this challenge. As you can see, there are 5 main functions in the process of defining a privacy framework, which could be replicated for preventive solutions. The key point after collecting these challenges is to categorize them and identify and assign every function for every different profile. There is an example of a regular company, and I'm going to focus now in the data example because I'm in the data department, so it's more easier for me to focus on this. As you can see in this example, we could have different functions like identify the problem, how to govern this data, how to control the access of this data, how to communicate between the team or the teams that work with the data, and how to protect it. And then once we have defined everything in the core, we have the different profiles of the people. But this is currently how we work now. We just have the identification, the govern, and the protection. But it is key with the artificial intelligence to incorporate also the communication and the protection. Now, going back to the critical infrastructure problem, NIST also provides an improvement framework to save and improving the critical cybersecurity of it. Now we have to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover from these issues when they happen. Also, I would like to mention that civil society is another role that is key into the ecosystem. As Georgie mentioned, cooperation is key because each individual knows the threats and soon know the threats of their corresponding role and how to solve them. And it would be easier and faster to press the right button and switch on the preventive protocol that has to be activated. It is a similar case when we are in a phishing problem and the hacker wants to pivot to the rest of the system. If you know that you shouldn't click in anything from the sender, then you are avoiding the risk. Or another example, when you think and trust the other side, for example, when you talk with a bank agent. So in that example, the civil should know that they won't be asked about their full ID, their sensitive information, etc., etc. When bots or other artificial intelligence is involved, it is even more critical to inform all the civils about these potential issues and how to avoid them. But what role does the digital nature of the current infrastructure play? Well, now we have more devices connected and we are able to monitorize every single critical element of it. This means that more devices are connected to the internet and therefore they are now more vulnerable. For instance, this would be the case with many IoTs and sensors, the database. The monitoring tool could be hacked. The sensor could be switched off while we are receiving in our screen data that is active. And this could be an example of a critical infrastructure from a fabric. So the main threat from my point of view is that we cannot prevent completely these attacks, and therefore we have to focus both in educating civils about potential attacks and also how to respond quickly to them. Here I saw some of the privacy measurements that NIST proposed, but of course, when these range and industries are so wide, we need to examine each case. And that's all from my side. Thank you for your attention. And since cybersecurity is as important for us as data, please remember that we are looking for talent as well. Thank you.
Especially for keeping the time, which will help us here a bit. It was such a rich presentation, and I think I like especially the focus on the role of the user and the individual and civil society, which I think links really well to the previous panel we had here, where we talked a lot about privacy and data protection. Nevertheless, let's now give the floor to our next speaker, Karel Reker, who now joined us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you. Just a short introduction. It was mentioned my military and special forces past, when I usually focused on destroying critical infrastructure. But what I guess is more important now is that for the last nearly 2 years, I have been the director of the Czech National Cyber and Information Security Agency. So we are the agency responsible for protecting the country in cyberspace, and the resilience and protection of critical infrastructure is our main focus. We also have some other roles like the protection of classified information and ICMs and so on, but the cybersecurity is, I would say, the main role. So that's who I am. I won't have any slides, but I will try to be short and clear, and I will just try to complement what has been said already. So where are we now? Basically, now what we observed over the last few years, and it's continuing trend, is that the cyber threats are rising, and that includes the critical infrastructure. We have seen the increase of cyber attacks, not only in quantity, but also in complexity and quality of those attacks. And this will continue, obviously. That has a lot to do with this really great speed of this digitalization of our societies and broadening of attack surface. That also includes the critical infrastructure, but also everything else. And obviously, the EDTs, the emerging disruptive technologies, also have its role. It was mentioned here, and there was talk about the artificial intelligence. But not only that, it's also, we could talk about quantum computing, big data analysis, what has been mentioned here, automation, and so on. And our societies are becoming more and will become more dependent on those technologies. And that will also make us more vulnerable. That will increase the attack surface. And the attacks on the critical infrastructure will then be rising. And it's fair to assume this. Also, what is one of the trends is that, and what we'll probably see is that more and more of the IT services will be outsourced through the managed service providers. And there is already increased reliance on technologies provided by third parties, such as cloud computing and others. And what it means is that the customers and the administrators of the infrastructure, they can only control, or they have a control only to the limited extent. What it also means is, what's also happening is that all above mentioned and the complicated structure of the digital world, and also the next generation networks, not only the 5G, but also the 6G and whatever is coming next, will lead to more exploitations through technology supply chains. And that is already becoming an issue, supply chain security. And that's roughly where we are right now. What we need is very much proactive approach, and it has been mentioned here a lot about the sharing the information, using the technology and automation and AI-based technology for the defense, and especially sharing and cooperating and sharing the knowledge, experience, and information at all levels, including with the private sector, and especially in regards to the CTI, the cyber threat intelligence. So who is the attacker really towards the critical infrastructure? It can be anyone. And to be honest, it doesn't matter whether it's criminal, whether it's activist, whether it's state actor, espionage, or whether it's part of war. We saw and we have seen kind of the massive campaigns which can hit our critical infrastructure by accident. We can see also very much targeted attacks with state and non-state actors, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't even matter if it's your own fault in your technical systems. The impacts are still great. And we can see it also with the ransomware now. The ransomware is primarily the criminal act, usually in order to get the money, but it came to the state that it's becoming a national security issue. So it's not a criminal problem only now. And I would just mention maybe a couple of points to the critical infrastructure protection. I think we need to realize that there's no final line. It's a continuous process, and it will always be a continuous process and struggle. It will never end. There's nothing like you will do something and you are done. You will be never done. So that's the first principle I would say. The second, we really need a risk-based approach. At least that's what we believe in Czech Republic, and it has been mentioned before here that it's about allocating priorities. And if you prioritize everything, you prioritize nothing. So you really need to have risk-based and impact-based approach and prioritize. That's how we look at the critical infrastructure, and that's our experience. Also, what you need really is the whole of government and not only whole of government, whole of society approach, because everyone needs to get involved. And if I just look at our national cybersecurity strategy, it has 3 pillars. One of the pillars, the first pillar is named confidently in cyberspace. And that consists of also resilience of society and resilience of the resilient critical infrastructure and capabilities and capacities to protect it. But it also has the other 2 pillars, and one is the strong and reliable alliances and international cooperation, and the third pillar is about resilience of society and awareness and education and so on. And the truth is even though the critical infrastructure protection is mostly stated in that first pillar, you cannot do it without those other 2 pillars. So really, you need the whole of society approach. That's really important. And I won't go into detail, but we can discuss it later. The other thing which I think is important is that the regulation is really important, and having a good risk-based regulation is really, really very much important. And today there are some international, but also sometimes national initiatives to expand the regulation, and that's okay because we realize that we are much more reliable on this function in IT. But again, you can expand the regulation as long as you keep the risk-based approach, because you cannot prioritize everything. But we already mentioned that. Other point I would like to mention is use of technologies, including the emerging disruptive technologies I mentioned. They play a big role, whether you talk about, it was mentioned here, the big data analysis, the automation of the targeting for the attacks, the automation of C2 during the attacks, and so on and so on. Or whether it's going to be quantum and the impact on crypto. But it's not only on the attacker side, it's also on the defender side, and it goes, shoulder to shoulder. So we also need to explore this technology, try to understand them and use them for the defense. And we should be the leaders of change And I know it's kind of a fashion word, leaders of change, but it really, what it means is that we shouldn't be just watching the changes happening and then following. We should be in the front of the changes and trying to explore it and think about tomorrow, not just today, even though we are busy with today. Another point I would like to mention is our experience that you really need appropriate legal tools, while it all must be based on our core values, which is individual freedoms, human rights, multi-stakeholder approach, and so on, and protection of privacy and so on. But the appropriate and effective legal tools are really important. And I won't go into details now because I want to save the time for discussion, but I can give you some examples based on how we dealt with the attacks on our hospitals last year, and having a good regulation, which wasn't very good at the time for the hospitals and healthcare sector, but having a good regulation and having good legal tools is really crucial to handle those situations. Also, another point I want to make is that, and it's really important, cybersecurity is a complex discipline. It's not technical, it's complex. It's both technical, it's non-technical. It goes through, if you look at this standard traditional model of instruments of national power like diplomacy, information, military economy, the cyber goes through all of them, but cyber is also dependent on all of them, cybersecurity. So you very much need to be active in cyber diplomacy. You very much need to look at the economy side and everything else. So it's a complex discipline. It's not just the IT geeks, doing something. And what is also important is that cybersecurity is not a technical challenge. It's a leadership challenge. It's a leadership challenge whether you work in the company, small business, medium business, or whether you run in the state. It's always with the leadership where the decisions are made, when the decisions about the legislation, about budgeting, about education, regulation, and so on. And sometimes, why I'm mentioning it, I know it sounds clear, but sometimes it's not. And many times that's really hardest thing is to persuade the management of the organizations that it's really their business. It's not their, it's not their chief information officer or it's not their IT department problem. It's a leadership problem to be secure and protect the infrastructure. So I think that's just a couple of points I wanted to make, and I will stop there. And I can illustrate maybe some of that on examples later on during the discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much again for this rich introduction. I think what came out for me especially is this idea that maybe when we talk about critical infrastructure, it's really more about the society and critical infrastructure as a social issue than really a technical one. Anyhow, we will now have our last speaker, Andreas Kuhn. And also just as a reminder, please put already in your questions you have about the previous inputs, so we can immediately start with the Q&A afterwards. Please, Andreas Kuhn, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andreas Kuhn. I'm joining you from the US West Coast, and I'm a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation America, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me and for organizing this really excellent conference. And I'm excited to be on this panel to share my thoughts on critical infrastructure protection, but also kind of to learn, really thankful to learn about the very different perspectives of my fellow panelists, and also looking very much forward to our discussion. Hopefully, time permitting, we have a robust discussion here. I think we all are in a violent agreement that the critical infrastructure is under threat. The threat and risk landscapes have significantly changed in recent years, and we observe that scale and scope of incidents targeting critical infrastructure are increasing and reaching levels that we have not seen before. Saying that, the numbers of actors is expanding as we see the cost of conducting cyber operations are declining, while at the same time the professionalization of cybercrime, difficult work, or kind of crime as a service are expanding. We've heard before from other speakers that criminal state and state-sponsored actors are targeting critical infrastructure as part of criminal operations for financial gains. but also cyber espionage to gain proprietary access to intellectual property, commercial intellectual property, but also more in recent years, kind of attacks towards COVID-19 development and research. I think at the same time, it's important to point out that states increasingly are, as part of a securitization of cyberspace, asserting their power and dominance in cyberspace as part of military defense forward campaigns below the threshold of armed conflict. I think a key point in all this development is the digital transformation, which is expanding the attack vector, which Karel correctly pointed out before, and it's a key driver of the direction that this development is taking. More and more devices and critical infrastructure are interconnected and create new interdependencies and risk. Think of all the technical and functional dependencies, which can have wide-ranging effects. Just kind of like, we not to make it too abstract here, to have like a quick example is, think of a transportation management solution with a cloud provider as a third party is hit in a cyber incidents, for example, ransomware, a very common occurrence, unfortunately, in the past few years. As a consequence, operations in many domains for multiple cities may come to a halt, being disrupted or bring to a halt public transportation or commercial logistics, and can cause disruption and financial losses across multiple industries and sectors that depend on transportation as a critical infrastructure service. And this, as I think, as Igor mentioned, this would be a very good example of kind of like the cascading effect along a value chain that such incidents can have. Unfortunately, examples to illustrate such incidents are plenty. In 2021, critical infrastructure providers were targeted in the energy, healthcare, and transportation sectors all around the globe. But I think also COVID-19, kind of like something that I think that we all cared about a lot personally, but also from the critical infrastructure perspective, provides a showcase, a case study, how critical infrastructure as a concept is or must be broadened. With millions working now remotely from home, new infrastructure needs to be secured on a new scale, as we are adding kind of the remote workforce as a new critical element in a nation's digital economy. Clearly, and I think as our first speaker pointed out, we need to think harder about how we want to define critical infrastructure. Old definitions that are often very sector specific seem insufficient to fully address cross-sector dependencies. But the past few years have already shown the need to think broader. The threats that target democratic processes and political institutions, as well as the information campaigns, which have resulted in the significant challenges and new threats for security and safety in cyberspace, but I think more importantly also in the physical world. So now, let me give you a kind of like a quick outline on approaches that governments and industries have been coming up to address some of those new challenges and risks to secure critical infrastructure. The list that I'm coming up here with is, no particular order, but I think maybe provide some food for thoughts for our further conversation. There is active cyber defense as one element here. Law enforcement in the US and Europe have turned to active cyber defense, a somewhat ill-defined set of measures that go beyond defending a target's infrastructure, but include the pursuit of perpetrators at the source of the attack. The 2021 Emotet takedown by the German Federal Criminal Police and the removal of malicious software from hundreds of privately owned computers without prior notifications by the US FBI's Hafnium operations are example of that. The so-called software bill of materials for critical infrastructure is another approach. Software bill of materials is a formal record containing details and supply chain relationships of various components, libraries, and modules used in building and operating software and hardware. It provides transparency and security attestation, but also enables the operators of critical infrastructure to assess their vulnerability after the disclosure of a security flaw. and should enable them to fix them appropriately. But also, ideally, it should incentivize operators to use only current, up-to-date components in their operations. The Linux Foundation Energy Forum is an example of an organization that has been working towards a proof of concept together with industry to test SBOMs for the energy grid. I'm also glad that I think Christina mentioned kind of users, and here cybersecurity labels come to mind. Labels provide users a way to assess the security or get some information about the security of a label at the time when they're purchasing a device. And I think this is becoming more important as a large workforce is working from home, and we need to have also the users in those conversations about protecting critical infrastructure. Another example here will be the use of semiconductor hardware-based enabled security. And this is in the context of many efforts in the US, but also in other countries around the globe to invest heavily in infrastructure development as part of post-pandemic recovery plans. This is a huge opportunity to invest in modern digital infrastructure that is secure. Critical infrastructure can benefit from leveraging such security functions such as authentication, encryption, and secure storage that are built into semiconductors, as well as the development of chips that are more secure and safe and specific to critical infrastructure operations. But I think there are also more indirect measures we need to think about. Think about all the enabling and factors, in particular economic incentives that underlie ransomware attacks, kind of cryptocurrencies as a largely anonymous and hard to trace issue, right? What can be done in this space that to indirectly prevent such crime from occurring and protect critical infrastructure? Recent high-profile cases led to policy responses in the US, for example, the declaration of ransomware as a national security threat, and a number of executive orders that address ransomware as well as cryptocurrencies in form of sanctions. But I think personally, the most important and promising way to improve critical infrastructure cybersecurity is through resilience. That is, designing and operating critical infrastructure in a manner that even when critical systems face acute shocks or disruptions, they can fail safe and recover while continue to deliver essential services. This requires, though, to invest in redundant infrastructure, which is expensive, as well as capacity, coming up with backup operations on a technical as well as an organizational level. And I think I should add here that this also should have a fair amount of training and exercises in place to hone in coordinated cross-industry responses to critical infrastructure incidents. And I think it might have been Karel who also mentioned that, right? It doesn't really matter if this is caused by cyber incidents, but I think all those measures would also help to prevent kind of the worst effects of natural catastrophes, human errors, or technical failures, which are something we need to work on as well. So cyber is not the only issue that we need to think about. So this was my list. Now we can have a long conversation about who should be doing what. I think I will stop that here and save that for our discussion. But I think one quick point I wanted to add before I end here is the issues that we need to address at the international level. The United Nations in particular, and other regional or private sector fora very much needed progress in critical infrastructure protection needs to be made. Think about the discussion at the United Nations on the rules and principles and responsible state behavior, such as Norm H of the 2021 UNGG report, which states that states should respond to appropriate requests for assistance by another state whose critical infrastructure is subject to malicious ICT acts. But there are also other sector-specific actions, such as the Cyber Peace Institute's call to action to stop cyber attacks on the healthcare sector and others. But besides this normative work, we also need to make sure that we have the capacity in place, particularly for digitally less developed nations, to have the necessary tools at hand to develop and maintain secure internet-connected critical infrastructure. and have the capacity in an international cybersecurity cooperation with regards to prevention, response, and mitigation. Thank you for your attention. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this input. And thanks a lot for mentioning semiconductors, since I'm just starting a research project about it. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about this a bit nerdy, but also very interesting and critical infrastructure over the next decades. And so we already have the first questions, but I would suggest to keep, to maybe just start with one single one at this point, because it's a big one, and actually it has just been mentioned by Mr. Kuhn.
So 5G is emerging technology. Christina, answer our question from panelists. What will be the threat number one in 6G, and when we will have the full capacity of 5G? I mean, slicing everywhere, private 5G nodes.
I was actually thinking about it because there are so many infrastructures that are critical, like we mentioned some of them, hospitals, anything related to politics and economics. Yeah, so I was actually thinking about my answer. So if anyone wants to take my place first, and then I will come up with my thoughts, it would be great.
If I can jump in, if I may, this is something that we get a lot from our counterparts, actually, from mostly the state views, of course. I mean, because we are, as Council of Europe, is mostly an intergovernmental organization working with states, also reaching out to civil society, what the needs are. But I think that, I mean, probably my answer will be a bit unorthodox, but the biggest infrastructure and the threat at the moment, what we see is democratic process. And this is where election interference comes in. And this is, again, I mean, because we're, again, the Council of Europe, which is built upon rule of law, democracy, rule of law, human rights, and democracy. For us, it's sort of one of the key sort of concerns when it comes. And we see it more and more, basically. So, I mean, with the rest of it will be much easier to provide examples of more specific ones. For example, again, the medical infrastructure, the internet service providers infrastructure, so global, let's say, communications providers and the others. But still, again, I think the democratic process is maybe sometimes a bit, unorthodox answer again, but should not be really discounted and taken off the scales.
Okay, if I can add from my experience, at least in our country, I mean, everyone is at risk. There's no exceptions, but I think the biggest risk usually goes to those who were not regulated before and who maybe were not so reliable on technologies before. So, for example, if I take the financial sector, the banks, they have been doing online banking for some time. They have to protect the money, and it's very, very crucial and critical for them to be protected. And there are some other sectors similar. So usually, I'm not saying they're not vulnerable, they are, but usually they have the highest standard. But if you go to, for example, hospitals, at least in our country, that's the case, or some other sectors, or maybe even the schools, universities, local municipalities, or also depends how you define your critical infrastructure. It's probably not critical infrastructure, all of that, but those are usually more vulnerable because they didn't deal with those threats and they don't have the ecosystem and the mindset, to protect themselves in the cyberspace. So that's just one of the observations.
Yeah, thanks.
I just want to add.
Sure, please add.
Yeah, if I can just shortly. So like the case in Brno, I mean, last year with the hospital, right? So when we can look at the situation a different angle. I mean, in some cases we can say, okay, this is not critical infrastructure, right? Because this is small hospital, there is another one. But then we can see that, okay, this is a COVID situation, there was a lab, and probably patients did not receive some help. Some patients postponed their surgery, whatever. I mean, so it's interconnected with the safety of patients, with the health of patients. The same with energy infrastructure, DSO, distribution of energy generation. So we can say, okay, in Ukraine there was blackout, 2 days without any electricity, the whole region. We can say that maybe it's not that huge damage, or but again, we need to consider cascading effects. I mean, because this is a core infrastructure, and it can impact a lot of other areas. Yeah.
I actually, if I can add, the burnout was a pretty big issue. It wasn't a small problem. It's nearly the second largest hospital, and it was at the stage where we were counting the beds in hospitals because of the wave of COVID coming. So it wasn't a small issue. It was a big issue.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Christina, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I completely agree with the panelists and what they said. I'm actually concerned as well about the energy area, the industry, because, well, we are in this problem of sustainability, and this could also make a great impact when it's not well managed. Like transportation, if you have an issue with transport, and a catastrophe could happen, right? So I think that we have mentioned the most relevant ones, but again, each person is involved and vulnerable to it, and we need these regulations to cope the velocity that the technology is growing, as fast as it's growing.
Thank you very much. We have one more question, which is picking up on something Mr. Reker said, but I think will be relevant for all of you. It says, Mr. Reker said that we should be the leaders of change. We should be in front of the changes. I think we can agree all on this, but what specifically should we focus on to be successful in this approach? Predicting the future developments in cybersecurity is becoming increasingly difficult. And I think it's a theme a lot of you mentioned already, this idea that things become more complex and more difficult to predict, so we can never achieve a 0 or 100% security. So yeah, Mr. Reker, but also the other speakers, what do you think about this notion about predicting the future and trying to adapt to change?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Also, I'll just kick out because it was my point. So I know it's tremendously difficult to and again, it's a sexy kind of words to be a leader of change, but what it means really, I think it's all about mindset. It's very hard, especially in public sector and being a state actor, because you are tied. You work with public money. So your acquisition process is very much controlled. It's slow. There's a lot of bureaucracy in state, but this can be overcome by setting the right organizational culture. And I think you just need to try to predict. You need to be dynamic. You cannot. You have to have a moral courage and be ready to fail sometimes. You shouldn't be too much risk averse because the failure moves you forward. And obviously you should try to predict. And I know it's hard to predict, but you can see some trends. So for example, right now we are discussing, the regulations which will come probably in 2 or 3 years, which will have to change maybe our system of regulation, for example. And we already sit in and discussing this, and then we look at the technologies and other things. So I think it's a lot about mindset. Obviously, there are restrictions. You cannot be perfect, but it's about not just waiting for someone to tell you or for things to happen, but being proactive and having initiative. And I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that's a really important point, but also probably the most difficult to put into practice, especially in big institutions. Do other people have to say something about that? Do they have something to add? Yeah, please.
Yes, if I may, just very, very shortly, and in full agreement with the previous speaker as well, but something to add here that in our experience as Council of Europe, again, we always choose the technology neutral language because we believe that at the moment it's probably not even possible to predict what will be the next security technology challenges out there. So let's say designing your regulations and designing your responses as neutral and technology neutral terms as possible is sometimes the way forward, and an approach that we have used for the last 20 years helping the states to implement the global standards on cybercrime. However, there is one thing that we always sort of work on, and it's a never-ending story. It's increasing the speed of cooperation. And that also, I mean, it goes all the way to very formal ways of cooperation, for example, between the law enforcement authorities or criminal justice authorities in general, to more informal ways of cooperation. So you will need more speed of cooperation on every incident, every investigation out there, irrespective of technology being used or gravity of it. So that's one of the ways forward that could, in some ways, mitigate the risks and challenges.
Yeah, I think now you both mentioned the need for cooperation and the need for to be agile and like forward thinking. And actually that speaks to the next question we have. How do you see cybersecurity cooperation across Europe? Isn't the bloc too vulnerable because of difference between the different EU member states? So do you think that the EU basically has advantages here or mainly disadvantages? And do they come from the different like positions in this area between the states? What's your point of view here? I can. It's a really big question, so maybe just focus on 1 or 2 points. Thanks.
Whoever is the question? Oh, okay. I would like to. I just my personal example with the collaboration for us from Ukraine. I mean. So in 2008, we opened iSolutions as a system integrator focusing on cybersecurity solutions. And since 2015, we started collaborating with European institutions. I mean, ENISA, Europol trained there, and then European Commission through Innovation Action calls, where we co-fund some new intellectual merits, let's say, and impact in Europe. So as an Eastern European country, Ukraine associated to EU, it's quite hard. I mean, reputational things and law enforcement agencies have some limitations in collaboration. So I believe that such instruments like Cost Action, Horizon Europe, all these instruments provided by European Commission is really good framework for us to collaborate. I mean, in Cost Action, where in Management Committee of Cost Action, where we develop AI approach to implement AI or any learning algorithms in digital forensics to investigate crimes, we collaborate with the law enforcement agencies of all the member states. Apart from that, we could have, of course, Europol, Interpol, but now we can collaborate closer through the innovation actions, research and innovation actions, R&D. So this is my personal view from, let's say, Ukraine as a associated country. And this is really good example for such collaboration. And second thing, we need to provide digital instruments to have anonymized data sharing, to share data anonymously, or to provide some sort of guarantee that this is trustworthy data. So, because otherwise, I mean, so there is lack of communication between member states, right? What to say about the world, and I do believe that digital instruments, when we can anonymize data, depersonalize it, and share it, just to train and instantly train other member states with the ongoing attack. So a hospital in Brno should share these traces of attacks instantly, within the seconds, with the hospital in France. And that's what we need to do in Europe.
Other opinions about the EU?
If I can add on that, I think this is what the EU is trying to achieve with this new 2020 EU cybersecurity strategy for the digital decade. There is this ambitious initiative, European Cyber Shield, putting together the network of security operation centers, getting more sharing. You see the NIS2 directive coming forward with, much more, even mandatory, sharing of information, reporting incidents, and so on. And there's huge money going into this establishing the networks of those competence centers for the R&D, in cybersecurity and everything else. So I think it's good. I mean, in my view, at least because I spend most of my time in military, so I dealt usually with NATO, and come into dealing now more with the EU than I did before. It is rather complicated organization. There's a lot of internal dynamics. It's a very complex thing. And you can hear sometimes different complaints about the EU and how difficult things are and so on. But to be honest, it creates a really good framework for cooperation and sharing. And being in EU, it makes it all so much easier with having harmonized legal systems, getting more easier legally sharing information, both classified and unclassified. And plus number of those initiatives I mentioned before. So I think, the life is not ideal, but I think the EU creates a pretty good framework for moving things forward. And I think it's trying to move cybersecurity forward really hard.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this.
I would like to add also about the traces in the network, because I just recall when we were speaking right now that there was a study of a co-worker of mine, Ana Mandalari, who discovered that some traces of IoT were sent to the developer of a robot she had at home, or just other traces like, I don't know, Apple TV or other device like that we have at home, sending traces that are not actually useful for the needs or the usage that you are gonna have this IoT device. So it is important also at the lower scale. We are now centering on the macro aspect of it, but also in the micro, there are issues to solve, and it is so important to focus on them, because it could be some device at your home or any device at your platform. And the collaboration in Europe doing this research, it was really good. And again, I haven't seen this in other places. So Europe is doing a really good task on trying to avoid these issues and addressing them as soon as they appear.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I would like to actually maybe conclude this panel with a last, maybe more hopeful question of what do you think has been the biggest achievement in the last 10 to 20 years in this area? I think we're all in a bit of a gloomy mode. The winter doesn't look too promising, so maybe you can start, tell us what do you think has been achieved so far? This is a difficult question. I'm so sorry. Try to
let me start very quickly. Sure. I'll try to read it with more cheering news, because again, when it comes to speaking about the criminal justice field, the more cybercrime field, we have actually more and more countries joining the global standards and more cooperative actually with the states of the European Union, but also with the core, let's say, member states of the Council of Europe as well, when it comes to cybercrime electronic evidence. That is very visible. For example, when it comes to cooperation around, let's say, the Belgium terrorist attacks, around the Sri Lankan, for example, case if we go outside Europe, or even New Zealand attacks in Christchurch, it was cooperation done through really criminal justice channels created by the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, the Council of Europe Convention, in which actually a lot of states sent their responses within minutes and hours. So that was very helpful to handle those accidents. So I guess that cooperation is increasing. I mean, it's not that gloomy outlook as well. It's just it's never enough. And it should be faster as usual, because that's always a need for communications to be faster and faster, and cooperation to be more efficient.
Thanks a lot. Does someone else have some joyful concluding remarks for this panel?
Okay, I would sign what Jorge said before me. It's I think it's there's no reason for being sad about it. It's I think the things are moving forward in a huge speed. And if you look, you mentioned 20 years back, we wouldn't even have these discussions. And in the meantime, I think what is the most important thing is the awareness of the problem because, any solution start with identifying the problem and admitting the importance of the problem. And I think that has been done, and there is a huge multinational cooperation. If you look at the UN, if you look at the Cybercrime Budapest Convention, if you look at the implementation of international law in cyberspace, if you look at the creation of different initiatives, cooperation between private and public sector, and multinational cooperation, legislation, I mean everything, capacity building, different frameworks, looking from UN, OSCE, NATO, EU, I mean, you name it. So I think it's just like the threats are developing, we are developing in the same speed,
Thanks a lot.